I'm currently sitting in front of three browser tabs that I can't stop refreshing. One displays Halifax port traffic data, another shows the Port of New York and New Jersey's monthly volume reports, and the third reveals a diplomatic cable that has international law scholars using terms they typically avoid in public. Words like unprecedented and colonial. What I'm about to share with you in the next few minutes will fundamentally change your understanding of this trade war. This isn't due to a new tariff, a fresh threat, or a policy shift. It's because of a demand so audacious, so legally indefensible, and so historically charged that the moment it was made, the outcome of the entire conflict became clear. Not in statistics or treaties, but in a physical, undeniable, measurable reality. Which ports are bustling and which are deserted? Who is demanding the keys to which? Stay with me because this is the moment everything changed. Subscribe to the Sarah Michelle YouTube channel right now if you haven't already, because what I'm about to walk you through is the kind of story that doesn't stand still. The port situation is evolving in real time, and you need to be here for the next development. Let's rewind, not weeks or months, but to the moment the demand landed and trace how we got here. This demand wasn't leaked or rumored. It came through official diplomatic channels as a formal note from the State Department to the Canadian Foreign Ministry. It outlined what it called proposed bilateral port cooperation measures. This was reinforced publicly when Trump stood at a press conference and stated, "Canada's ports are handling trade that belongs in American ports. Billions and billions of dollars of trade that should be going through New York and Savannah and Long Beach is going through Halifax and Vancouver because of very unfair deals that Canada made behind our backs. We need access. We need authority. And we need a fair share of the revenue that our trade is generating in their ports." Read that again. Not a trade concession, not a customs arrangement, not regulatory alignment on shipping standards, operational control. American customs officials with jurisdictional authority inside Canadian port facilities. American regulatory power imposed on ports built with Canadian money, operated by Canadian workers, maintained by Canadian investment, and governed by Canadian law. Mark Carney's response came within 4 hours and was just 2 sentences long, the fastest official response of the entire trade war. Canadian ports are Canadian sovereign territory. This conversation is over. 14 words. The reason this response was so brief is that the demand was so far outside the boundaries of legitimate bilateral relations between sovereign nations that a longer response would have dignified it. You don't write a dissertation when someone demands the keys to your house. You simply say no. Now, here's what makes the demand legible. Here's what explains why Washington reached for such an audacious lever. Because the ports told the story first. Before the demand, before the diplomatic note, and before the press conference, the ports revealed everything. You just needed to look at the numbers. Let's start with Halifax. Halifax was upgraded for $37 million in what was announced as routine infrastructure modernization. What it became is the primary North Atlantic logistics hub for a European-Asian trade corridor that bypasses the United States entirely. Container throughput has increased by 61% year over year. 14 major global shipping lines, which previously used New York, Norfolk, or Savannah as their Atlantic hub, have established Halifax as either a primary or secondary North Atlantic routing point. The preferential trade agreements with 19 nations signed alongside the original port upgrade are driving customs-cleared cargo through Halifax at processing speeds that American ports structurally cannot match. Sub-4-hour preclearance through digital systems versus the 36 to 72 hours typical at major American facilities. Port revenue has more than doubled. The Halifax Port Authority has approved a $340 million expansion funded entirely by operational revenue, not government subsidy, to add terminal capacity for the volume that is still growing, still accelerating, and showing no signs of plateauing. That's Halifax. But it doesn't stop there. Vancouver and Prince Rupert, Canada's Pacific Gateway ports, are handling the surge in Asian trade generated by the Pacific Atlantic Economic Compact, the agricultural export diversification to 23 nations, and the supply chain restructuring from corporate relocations that are moving billions in commerce through Canadian logistics networks. container volume at Vancouver is up 43% year over year, while Prince Rupert, the fastest growing port in North America, has increased throughput by 57%, with a further expansion underway that will double its capacity within 3 years. The Trans-Canadian Corridor is now fully operational as an integrated system. Goods arriving from Asia at Pacific ports cross Canada by a Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Rail, departing from Halifax for European markets. A complete transcontinental trade route has been assembled piece by piece across the trade war, now moving billions in commerce annually, entirely through Canadian infrastructure, Canadian customs jurisdiction, and Canadian sovereign territory. Montreal's St. Lawrence Gateway is handling increased European trade, industrial supply chains of relocated corporations, and agricultural exports flowing through the Great Lakes Corridor, with volume up 31%. The aggregate picture, the picture that triggered the demand, shows that Canadian port revenue across all major facilities has increased by an estimated $6.8 billion annually since the trade war began. That's not a rounding error. That's a structural transformation. Now we get to the other side of the ledger. The Port of New York and New Jersey, the flagship of American Atlantic commerce and the largest port complex on the East Coast, has seen container volume decline by 19% since the Halifax corridor became fully operational. Shipping lines that rerouted to Halifax have not returned because the rerouting was not temporary. It was a structural optimization driven by faster processing, lower costs, preferential customs treatment, and freedom from American tariff volatility that makes commercial planning through U.S. ports unreliable. The Port Authority's revenue projections, which assumed continued growth based on decades of historical trends, have been revised downward for 4 consecutive quarters. Savannah, previously the fastest-growing American port before the trade war, has seen 3 major shipping lines defer or cancel planned route expansions. Norfolk, Charleston, Baltimore, and Boston, every major American East Coast port is reporting volume declines in the high-value international transit cargo category that generates the most revenue per container. That's the cargo that made American ports global hubs rather than just regional unloading docks, and it has migrated to Canada. The picture is equally stark on the West Coast. Long Beach and Los Angeles, the busiest port complex in the Western Hemisphere for decades, and the gateway through which the majority of Asian commerce entered the American economy, are reporting declines in Asian trade volume as the Pacific Atlantic Compact routes an increasing share of commerce through Canadian Pacific ports. Seattle and Tacoma are losing market share to a competitor that now operates within a trade bloc with Japan, South Korea, India, and Australia, offering preferential terms that American ports structurally cannot match because the United States is not a member of that framework. This competitive disadvantage is not temporary. It cannot be corrected by investment alone. The American Association of Port Authorities issued a report naming the cause with a directness the organization has never used in a public document before. The decline is structurally driven by trade policy consequences that have permanently redirected international commerce to competing infrastructure. The industry that runs American ports knows exactly why the ports are emptying. The trade war did this. Instead of building better ports, competing for trade, or addressing the policies that caused the decline, Washington demanded access to the ports that were winning. Hit the like button on this video if this is making sense so far, and leave me a comment because I want to know. Did you see this coming? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Now let's examine what was actually demanded, because the formal demand contained 4 elements, each escalating in audacity. First, Joint Customs Authority. American Customs and Border Protection officers stationed at Canadian port facilities with the authority to inspect, delay, redirect, or hold cargo transiting through Canadian ports destined for or originating from the United States or from nations subject to American sanctions. This would grant American officials decision-making power inside Canadian sovereign territory over cargo that Canada has already cleared through its customs processes, effectively allowing a foreign government to overrule Canadian sovereign jurisdiction on Canadian soil. Second, preferential berth allocation. guaranteed priority docking for vessels carrying American origin cargo at Canadian port terminals, requiring Canada to give American commerce first position in the queue at ports that Canada built and operates, ahead of the trading partners whose agreements and commerce created the port growth in the first place. Third, and this is the element that drew the sharpest international legal reaction, revenue sharing. A demand that Canada share a percentage of port revenue and customs duties with the United States on the grounds that Canadian port growth was driven by trade diverted from American ports by unfair Canadian trade practices. This demand framed Canada's successful diversification strategy as theft, entitling the United States to financial compensation, as if the voluntary commercial decisions of thousands of private shipping companies choosing Canadian ports for better terms constituted a wrong that required remedy. Fourth, regulatory alignment, a demand that Canadian ports adopt American customs security protocols, inspection standards, and cargo processing procedures, which would effectively subject Canadian port operations to American regulatory authority. Ironically, this would destroy the processing speed advantage that makes Canadian ports competitive in the first place. American customs processing averages 36 to 72 hours, while Canadian pre-clearance operates in under 4 hours. Demanding that Canada adopt the slower system is tantamount to asking Canada to sabotage the very capability that attracted the trade. International legal scholars reacted within hours. The demand violates United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea provisions on port state sovereignty. It violates World Trade Organization principles on sovereign control of domestic infrastructure. A Georgetown international law professor labeled it, as reported by multiple outlets, the most extraordinary assertion of extraterritorial jurisdiction over Allied sovereign infrastructure in the post-World War II era. The historical parallel that scholars, diplomats, and international media quickly adopted was one Washington could least afford: colonial port concessions, the system by which European imperial powers in the 19th and early 20th centuries demanded operational control of ports in China, Africa, and Southeast Asia as a condition of trade. The structural parallel is not rhetorical, it is precise. A more powerful nation demanding operational authority over a less powerful nation's port infrastructure, because the more powerful nation's commerce is declining while the less powerful nation's is growing. Brazil's foreign minister, representing a nation that endured colonial-era port control for centuries, stated, "We recognize this demand for what it is. It is the language of the 19th century applied to the 21st. Now, here's what matters more than whether the demand is absurd, because it is obviously completely and unarguably absurd. What matters is that the demand was made because it tells you everything about where the trade war actually stands." Let's review the sequence of what Washington deployed and what happened. The tariffs didn't work. They caused the trade diversion that created the Canadian port boom. The diplomatic pressure didn't work. Canada built the trade bloc, the Halifax corridor, and the agricultural diversification under sustained pressure and emerged stronger from every confrontation. The energy threats didn't work. Canada diversified its energy partnerships. The erosion of defense partnerships didn't work. Canada built new defense relationships with Europe and South Korea. The demand for Carney's resignation didn't work. It unified the country behind him. The potash tariff didn't work. It enriched Canadian producers and impoverished American farmers. Nothing worked. Every tool Washington deployed either failed outright or backfired into a Canadian advantage. When every tool has failed, the only thing left is the unreasonable demand, the lunge for something you can't have because there's nothing left to reach for. By demanding a share of Canadian port revenue on the grounds that the trade should have been American, Washington admitted that the trade is no longer American. The claim is a concession. "This trade should be ours," is the language of someone who knows it isn't. Warren Buffett addressed the demand, and his analysis didn't focus on the demand itself, which he dismissed in a single sentence as, in his words, the diplomatic equivalent of a bankruptcy filing, but on what the demand reveals about the stage of competition Washington has entered. He said, "In 70 years of watching companies compete, I've learned to recognize the stages of competitive failure because they are the same every time in every industry at every scale without a single exception in my experience. Stage 1 is denial. The competitor is dismissed as too small, their product inferior, and they'll never scale. Stage 2 is imitation. The incumbent tries to copy what the competitor is doing, usually too late and without understanding the design philosophy behind it, resulting in an expensive replica that misses the point. Stage 3 is aggression. The incumbent attacks the competitor directly with pricing wars, legal action, lobbying, and regulatory capture, every weapon the institutional arsenal provides. Stage 4 is desperation. The incumbent stops trying to compete altogether and starts demanding access to what the competitor built, demanding to share the revenue, to use the infrastructure, to get the keys to the building someone else constructed. Stage 4 is where the demand for Canadian port control sits. It is the final stage, and it is the stage from which companies and countries do not recover because desperation reveals a truth that no subsequent action can undo. You have nothing left to offer. Once the market or the world sees that, the perception does not reverse. Buffett applied this analysis with the directness of someone who has witnessed this exact pattern consume dominant firms across every decade of his career. The United States built the greatest port infrastructure in the world. For decades, American ports were the gateway, the primary interface between the global economy and the largest consumer market on Earth. Then, over the course of a few years, the policies that were supposed to strengthen that infrastructure drove commerce to a competitor. Not because the competitor cheated or stole, but because the competitor built better terms, faster processing, more stable partnerships, and a trade network that made its ports more attractive. That is competition, and America lost. Buffett's diagnostic was the simplest possible. Here is the test for desperation in business or geopolitics, a test that has never been wrong. If you're demanding access to something someone else built instead of building your own, you've lost because the act of demanding reveals that you cannot build it yourself. If America could build ports that competed with Halifax and Vancouver, ports with equivalent trade agreements, processing speeds, and shipping line commitments, it would build them. The demand is the admission that it can't. His closing statement carried the finality of a verdict delivered after a long deliberation that everyone already knew the outcome of. Trump demanded control of Canadian ports. Carney said no in 14 words. The world now knows, not because Carney declared victory, but because Trump did, that the most powerful economy on Earth is asking for access to infrastructure it couldn't build, couldn't match, and can't compete with. That is not a negotiating position. It is a concession speech delivered in the language of demands. The international reaction carried an alarm that extended far beyond the US-Canada relationship. The European Commission issued a statement affirming that sovereign control of domestic port infrastructure is a fundamental right of every nation and cannot be subject to bilateral demands arising from trade disputes. Japan's trade minister called the proposal without precedent in modern international commerce. The WTO Director General issued a rare public comment reinforcing port state sovereignty as a cornerstone of the international trading system. Inside the United States, the demand produced a reaction the White House had not anticipated. Not anger, not partisan division, but bipartisan embarrassment. American businesses that currently use Canadian ports, thousands of them, reacted with alarm at a demand that could trigger Canadian countermeasures, restricting the American access that already exists. The demand threatened to destroy the very access it was ostensibly seeking. The American Association of Port Authorities distanced itself publicly. As reported by Reuters, the organization stated that competitive challenges facing American ports are best addressed through investment, innovation, and policy reform, not through demands for access to foreign sovereign infrastructure. Republican senators who understood international law distanced themselves within hours. One senior member of the Commerce Committee, according to Bloomberg, stated, "We should be investing in our own ports, not demanding keys to theirs. This makes us look weak, not strong." A Democratic strategist delivered a line that became the domestic media's framing for the week. When you've gone from imposing tariffs to demanding control of someone else's ports, you haven't escalated, you've surrendered. You just did it loudly. The colonial comparison proved particularly corrosive domestically because the United States was founded in opposition to colonial economic extraction. The nation whose origin story is a revolution against imperial control, against taxation without representation, and against foreign authority imposed on domestic commerce is now demanding imperial-style control over its neighbors' commercial infrastructure. The irony was not lost on anyone, and the damage was not partisan, it was national. Then Carney was asked directly at a press conference in Ottawa. A reporter pressed him, Prime Minister, is there any scenario, any condition, any arrangement, any framework in which Canada would grant the United States authority over Canadian port operations? Carney paused and then answered with 3 sentences that built to a line that every port authority, every trade ministry, and every sovereign nation evaluating its own infrastructure security will quote for the next decade. Canada built these ports. Canadian workers operate them. Canadian investment financed them. Canadian trade agreements filled them. A breath. The ships are here because we earn them through better terms, faster processing, and partnerships that treat every trading nation with respect. Another breath. And then the line, you don't get to demand the keys to a house you didn't build just because your own is empty. The room held. The metaphor needed no explanation. A house, keys, building, emptiness. The person who did the work, who poured the foundation, who raised the walls, who filled the rooms, and the person standing at the door demanding entry because their own house is falling apart. Every human being understands that dynamic. Every culture, every language, every nation has a version of that story, and the moral is the same in every version. You don't get the keys. You build your own house, or you live with the one you have. Within hours, the line was trending globally. Within days, it was quoted in port authority boardrooms across 4 continents, in international trade law lectures, and in the diplomatic correspondences of nations that saw in Canada's refusal the defense of a principle they might need to invoke themselves someday soon. It required no context. The metaphor was the context. The house was the argument, and the empty house across the street was the verdict. Subscribe to the Sarah Michelle YouTube channel and hit the notification bell because this story isn't finished. What happens next in the ports, in the trade blocks, and in the diplomatic fallout from this demand will move fast, and you need to be here when it does. So here's where we stand. Canadian ports are surging: Halifax, Vancouver, Prince Rupert, Montreal, reporting double-digit annual growth rates driven by the accumulated consequences of 2 years of strategic diversification that rerouted global commerce through Canadian infrastructure. American ports are contracting at rates not seen in over a decade, losing the international transit cargo that made them global hubs. The President of the United States demanded operational control of Canadian port facilities, joint customs authority, preferential berth allocation, revenue sharing, and regulatory alignment, and was refused in 14 words. Buffett identified the demand as stage 4 of competitive failure, the final stage, the stage of desperation, the stage from which recovery does not occur. The international community recognized the demand for what it was, the language of the 19th century applied to the 21st. I see 2 paths from here, and I want to be honest about both of them. Path 1. The path that requires something Washington has not demonstrated, a genuine policy reversal. Someone in the administration accepts that the ports are not returning to their former volumes through demands or threats. The United States begins the long, expensive, structurally difficult work of rebuilding competitive port infrastructure, investment, trade agreement reform, processing modernization. This takes years, costs hundreds of billions, and requires publicly acknowledging that the trade war produced the opposite of its stated objectives. That is a hard thing for any government to do, and even harder for this one. Path 2 is the one I think we're on: escalation without a tool capable of producing the desired result. More demands, more pressure, more confrontation that backfires. The Canadian port network deepens its integration with the Halifax Corridor trading partners, with the Pacific Atlantic Compact member states, and with the European frameworks now routing through Montreal. Each escalation produces another Canadian diversification. Each threat generates another trade partnership. Each demand elicits another 14-word response, and the gap between which ports are full and which are empty continues to widen. I believe we are on path to. I thought that 3 days ago before this demand was made. The demand confirmed it. When the most powerful economy on Earth demands operational control of an allied nation's ports and is refused in 14 words that the entire world heard, we must ask ourselves, where does economic power actually reside? Is it in the size of the economy, or is it in the infrastructure the economy runs on? If every instrument of American economic coercion has been deployed over 2 years and has either failed or backfired into a Canadian advantage, what comes after desperation? The question that should define every economic strategy discussion in Washington for the next generation is this: when your ports are emptying and your neighbors are full, what is the answer? Do you demand their keys, or do you ask yourself honestly and without ego why you stopped building? Trump started a trade war to prove American economic dominance. Instead, the trade war emptied American ports and filled Canadian ones. And when the ports told the story of who is winning and who is losing through shipping containers, crane movements, and customs receipts, in the physical, measurable, visible reality of which harbors are full and which are quiet, Washington didn't invest in its own infrastructure, didn't reform its own policies, and didn't rebuild its own competitiveness. It demanded control of Canada's ports. That demand, audacious, unprecedented, and rejected in 14 words, along with the colonial comparisons made by international observers, will be remembered as the moment the trade war's outcome became undeniable. Not because Canada declared victory, but because the United States acknowledged it couldn't compete. And Carney, standing in a country whose ports are full, whose ships are arriving, and whose commerce is growing, gave the trade war its final defining and unanswerable image. You don't get to demand the keys to a house you didn't build just because your own is empty. Is Carney saving Canada, or is Washington simply losing to a country that outland it? Is the demand for port control a negotiating tactic, or is it the final move of a strategy that has run out of options? And the question that I think matters most, when the dust settles and we look back at this moment, which country will history say was building, and which country will history say was demanding? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. This channel, Sarah Michelle, is documenting the greatest wealth and infrastructure transfer in modern economic history. The mainstream media will spend the next week arguing about the politics while missing the math. The ships are turning, the ports are emptying, and the factories are migrating. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and send this to anyone you know who works in logistics, holds Apple stock, or still believes tariffs punish the other guy. Tomorrow morning, Trump will see Apple's stock soaring and American rail lines crashing. He will threaten Cook, he will threaten Canada, and he will post about it. And every time he does, another CEO will quietly open a map of Ontario and draw a circle. The hardware war is over. The spreadsheets won. Don't blink.